Hello, modern America historians. We are going to pick up where we left off with the civil rights era. We were talking a little bit about some famous events. Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954, which was a huge Supreme Court case that basically ended desegregation. But just ending it was going to be a long process. It was going to take a lot of years because people were going to put up a fight. We talked about the Montgomery bus boycott, which ended segregation on the buses and ended African Americans having to stand or sit in the back. That all ended because the bus service was losing so much money. The spark for that was the arrest of Rosa Parks that we discussed, and then also the death of Emmett Till, which brought attention to lynchings and murders and just the awful things that were happening in many southern states. And so that gets us into a little bit of the 1950s where rock and roll was basically being born. We earlier, when we were talking about 1950s culture, read a little bit about Elvis. Saw, he's the king of rock and roll. Well, it wasn't at this point. It wasn't just white musicians producing rock and roll, which was new here in the 50s, but you also had African American musicians. One of the most famous, just died a couple years ago, was Chuck Berry. Had several hits in the 1950s and 60s, and lived a long time. Johnny B. Good, I've got a link here. I'll put a link later on because we can't listen to it on this. But one of the things you start seeing with rock and roll is it starts desegregating certain public places. Also, you have people of all races listening to this music. In the past, it would have been maybe unlikely for a white person to sit down and listen to African American music on the radio, if it even was on the radio. But that wouldn't have been heard of. And now all of a sudden, everybody's playing this music and everybody's listening to it. Little Richard, he's still alive. He had a big hit, 1955, Tutti Frutti. I'll have a link to that as well. But what you start seeing is, and there's stories where the concert goes on, and you look at this concert hall here. It's segregated, right? You've got white people on the right, black people on the left. And one of the things that these musicians talk about is as they start playing, and even though there were security guards, by the end of the night, everybody's dancing together. It's no longer segregated anymore. So music starts to bridge this gap. And we do see that oftentimes with social issues where before people will accept certain things, you see sports, you see music, you see art, theater start to bring people together. In 1957, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was created, which was a civil rights organization. And it was one of these groups that was going to play a large role in the 50s and 60s in organizing different civil rights events. Martin Luther King Jr. was the first president. And basically, this group came about after the Montgomery bus boycott, saying, hey, that worked out really well. If we have this type of leadership in other places, we can make other changes as well. Brown versus Board of Education, 1955, we start to see some things happening after that, or 1954, I should say. In 1957, down in Arkansas, in Little Rock, 9 African-American students enrolled at the high school in 1957 for the first time. So that was going to be the first time you had African-American students going to school with white students. Now, this governor over here, Orville Fabus, was obviously a racist governor, and he said, no, they are not going in. And he sends in the Arkansas National Guard to prevent them from entering the school. So he sends in soldiers and says, no, they don't. You can see in the background here some very hostile-looking people. Now, this is going against what the Supreme Court said. So who has power over the state governments? The federal government. And the president at the time was Dwight D. Eisenhower. And so he says, okay, no, it's my job as president, as head of the executive branch, to enforce the laws, right? The Supreme Court decides whether the laws are fair or not. The legislative branch, Congress, creates laws, and the President of the United States and the executive branch enforces those laws. And so he says, yep, you got to let them in. He sends down the 101st Airborne Division, and they enforce and transport the students to school, home from school, to their classes to make sure everything's okay. So this is 1957 that this is going on. I mean, soldiers in the streets making sure the kids can go to school. I'll have a link set up later. You can see it's on Life magazine. The Little Rock Nine, as they're known, and people were mad. Phoebus is right, the sign says. Yep, militia with Phoebus. I don't know, down with something. Not a very good picture, but there's the 9 students back in the 90s celebrating the, I think, the 50th anniversary. And this one you can see inch by inch, the political cartoon, school segregation. It's not an easy process as they're pushing the door open. Now, Eisenhower was okay for segregation, but not great. This is Roy Wilkins. He is a University of Minnesota graduate. We have places named after him. If you go up to the University of Minnesota, there's a Roy Wilkins dormitory, Roy Wilkins Hall. If you go up by the Xcel Energy Center, there's the Roy Wilkins Auditorium, where you have theater and concerts, and I think the state gymnastics was held up there. So Roy Wilkins is a theater up there, or I guess not a theater, but it's a big auditorium that right by the Xcel Energy Center, kind of connected by a hallway. He was president of the NAACP for a long time, and he said President Eisenhower was a fine general and a good, decent man. But if he had fought World War II the way he fought for civil rights, we would all be speaking German now. So basically he meant Eisenhower wasn't very ambitious. This was not one of his big things. It'll be the guy that comes after Eisenhower, Kennedy, that actually starts to make some headway in civil rights. And then after Kennedy dies, Lyndon Johnson is the president that signs things up. Althea Gibson in 1956 had won a Grand Slam tennis event, and she is similar in regards to the musicians and Jackie Robinson for that matter, that she's crossing a color line in tennis before it's socially acceptable in many places in the United States to go into a restaurant or a school or wherever, and she's doing it on a world level as she became one of the greatest tennis players in the world in the 1950s. Miles Davis was a jazz musician. The jazz that he was playing was slower than what we remember hearing when we studied the 1920s. If you've ever watched, what was the show with Adam Sandler? Billy, what is it? Oh, I should know it. Where he goes back to school. Oh, I can't think of it, and I should. Not Happy Gilmore. Billy Madison, where the old lady's like, if peeing your pants is cool, consider me Miles Davis. So he was cool, the birth of cool. Yeah, it took me a little too long to think of Billy Madison. And I'm sure you kids have never seen it, even though it's classic. If peeing your pants is cool, consider me Miles Davis. Yeah, gross. Motown Records was created 1959, and this is a African-American owned music label where they're promoting many African-American musicians, making very famous rock and roll music. Like you think about some famous Motown records, Aretha Franklin, the Jackson 5, a lot of famous musicians coming out of there. And now all of a sudden it's popular culture. Everybody's listening to this music in the 60s and 70s. Doesn't matter what race you are. So this starts to change American culture as well. 1960, This is in North Carolina. This is a Woolworths department store, so similar to like department stores like Macy's or Dayton's and department stores that used to exist. And so this is Woolworths in North Carolina where they had a lunch counter. This would be a popular area for people to go and sit down and eat lunch. Well, before 1960, or in 1960 and before, African Americans could go in and order food, but they couldn't sit down and eat it. So you could go in the store and shop, you could buy stuff, you could buy food, but you could not sit down and eat your lunch in the store like white people. And so a group of African American students decide to protest this. You can see here as they're sitting here, and some white students join in the protest. People are dumping food on them. Students are getting arrested as they sit there, being thrown out. You think about what worked. This starts going on at many Woolworths lunch counters across the country, but what worked for the Montgomery bus boycott? Not spending money. So these sit-ins occur when the students go in and sit down and just kind of post up at the lunch counter. You can see there's African American working there, but you can't sit down and have lunch. And so they were mistreated, they're arrested. It leads to violence and arrests. But these were called sit-ins. So it's once again non-violent protests. You can sit there, not do anything, make the cops come and arrest you without fighting back. And that starts happening across the South. And eventually, it's the same thing as the Montgomery boycott. African Americans and their supporters start to boycott Woolworths, and they aren't shopping there anymore, and the stores are losing money. And so after over $200,000 in losses, Woolworths department store says, okay, you can sit and have lunch. And basically it just so happened that the first guy to have lunch was one of the workers there, where the boss said, hey, take your break, sit down and eat your food at the counter. And that's how it was segregated or desegregated. And I'll have a video link to that as well. The last thing we're going to talk about were the Freedom Riders of 1961. There had been some Supreme Court rulings that said that segregation on interstate buses through the South was illegal. Meaning if you got on like a Greyhound bus and you were going across the country, they had to be segregated in the South. The lunch counters, the waiting rooms were segregated in the South. And there were Supreme Court rulings that said, no, that's illegal. Doesn't work that way anymore. And it was some different court cases that were similar to Brown versus Board of Education, something versus something, a couple famous ones. And the Freedom Riders decide, hey, the Constitution says we can do this just because the Jim Crow laws in the South say we can't. And so many college students in the North decide to protest this. And they get on the buses and they travel south. Well, what they run into is violence. Now, they were doing this in like North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia, and people there they might get a ticket or something from police officers, but they were being told, yeah, you're causing some trouble in our states. You better not do this in Alabama. You better not do this in Mississippi, because things are even worse there. Well, they didn't listen, and they went down there. And as they get to this point, the buses were stopped. You even had local police officers knew the buses were coming, called friends of theirs. They might have been part of the KKK as well, but they called friends of theirs in the KKK. KKK would show up, stop the buses, burn the buses, beat the riders mercilessly. And so everything was okay until they got to Alabama, and that's when the buses were stopped, burned, people beat up. The police officers who were in on it with the mob, with the protest there, or with the KKK, they would sit there and watch. And basically you had these people from Alabama beating up the riders, and as soon as they finished beating them up, the police would go in and arrest the people that just got beaten up. And so the news, of course, was taking pictures. It was ending up in the newspapers. Kennedy, who was president at the time, right here is JFK, and his brothers. He said that the riders were unpatriotic, not the people beating him up, because he said, hey, there's trouble right now with the Soviet Union, Cold War, you're making us look bad. The Soviet Union, of course, was telling the world, look, communism, everybody's equal. You go to the US, they treat people like second-class citizens over there. And so this was making us look bad. The rides did not stop. People kept riding. And Kennedy finally decides, I've got to do something about this. And he hires or sends in over 600 U.S. Marshals to protect the Freedom Riders. By the end of 1961, the Interstate Commerce Commission decides that, yes, segregation is going to be illegal, even though the Supreme Court already said it is. They said, we are going to start enforcing these laws. And so, yeah, there's struggle, but in the end, they make progress by not giving up. Many Freedom Riders arrested, kind of filling up the court system down there as well. There wasn't enough room in the jails anymore. We're going to continue learning about this guy, Bull Connors. He was the Commissioner of Public Safety in Alabama. They said he may have been more powerful than any person in Alabama, and he was incredibly racist. He encouraged violence toward the Freedom Riders. He made sure people that would go beat up the Freedom Riders were called. And this isn't going to be the last we hear of Bull Connors, because he's going to lead the fight in Alabama against civil rights. He blamed the Freedom Riders for violence. He said, if you didn't come here, there wouldn't have been any problems. So Bull Connors, certainly as history looks at him now, a bad guy, very racist. And he was one of the leaders of Alabama saying, we're not going to let you come into our state and do this. When he was arresting the Freedom Riders, he said it was for their own protection. And so we'll continue learning more about Bull Connors as we get into the 1960s and get closer to the Civil Rights Act. But he's definitely a name you're going to want to remember.